Is it possible to reconstruct the lost original manuscripts of New Testament?
Of that New Testament, the Greek, we have over 5,500 New Testament manuscripts today, from which we can reconstruct the entire New Testament many times over. You see, we have some New Testaments that go back to the 300s, whole Bible.
Really? The whole Bible?
So you can't say it's been changed. We have it from the 300s. We have some manuscripts that go back even further, to within 100 years of Jesus.
This cunning Christian apologist is lying, as if everyone is ignorant about the Bible.
94% of our surviving manuscripts come from the 9th century and later.
He said, if we lost all those Greek New Testament manuscripts, guess what? We have 10,000 Latin, Coptic, Syriac translations of the New Testament from early times, with which we could reconstruct the entire New Testament many times again. And if we lost all those, in the first 150 years after Jesus, there were people writing sermons and letters to one another where they quoted the New Testament. And so just from those letters and sermons, we can reconstruct virtually the entire New Testament many times over again.
What a shameless liar.
We have the quotations of the church fathers that he talked about. We have church fathers from the 2nd century who quote the New Testament all over the map, and in virtually every instance that they quote every instance that you have an author quoting the New Testament, the author has a different text from the text that's come down to us in the manuscripts.
Who is Bart Ehrman? Bart Ehrman is the James A. Gray Distinguished Professor at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Professor Ehrman completed his Master's of Divinity and Ph.D. degrees at Princeton Seminary. He is an expert on the New Testament and the history of early Christianity. 5 of his books have been on the New York Times bestseller list. His books have been translated into 27 languages.
The bigger question, though, is not whether we have the originals. The question is whether we can reconstruct the originals that have been lost. Can we reconstruct them or not? For many years, I thought that the answer was yes. But scholarship changed, and it became widely thought among scholars that we cannot reconstruct the original, and that it does not even make sense to talk about the originals. I started to understand why, and now I'm convinced. Let me say a few more things about the surviving copies of the New Testament and point out some of the problems we have with the surviving manuscripts. First, number of mistakes. I've told you that when scribes copy manuscripts, they make mistakes. And maybe you're thinking, yeah, well, says you. Is there like evidence of this, or is this just one of your other crazy opinions? Well, again, it is one of my crazy opinions, but there turns out to be evidence. We have 5,500 manuscripts of the New Testament. It is striking that when you compare these with one another in detail, no 2 of them are exactly alike in their wording. They all differ. Why do they differ? Because people are changing the text. Well, how many differences are there exactly? So, scholars have wondered about this for over 300 years. In the year 1707, there was a famous scholar named John Mill, who was an Oxford scholar, not related to John Stuart Mill, whom you may have heard of before. This is a different John Mill. John Mill spent 30 years of his life studying the manuscripts available to him. He had about 100 Greek manuscripts that he could examine. And he had the quotations of the New Testament in the ancient translations of the New Testament into Coptic and Syriac and Latin and so forth. And he had some quotations of the New Testament in the writings of the church fathers. And he had a bunch of evidence. And he looked at this evidence. And in 1707, after 30 years of labor, he published a book called the Novum Testamentum Graeci, the Greek New Testament. In this book, he gave a few lines of the text of the New Testament, and then below it indicated places where the manuscripts he looked at differed from one another. So this was an apparatus of readings. The apparatus showed where the manuscripts differed from one another. To the shock and dismay of many readers, John Mill's Novum Testamentum Graeci, in the apparatus, he indicated 30,000 places of difference among the manuscripts that he had examined. 30,000 places where the manuscripts differed from one another. And he was looking at 100 manuscripts. We have 5,500 manuscripts today. Well, how many differences are there among these manuscripts exactly? No one knows, because no one's been able to count them all. Some scholars say 200,000 differences. Some say 300,000 differences. Probably more accurately, 400,000 differences. It's easiest to put it in comparative terms. There are more differences in our manuscripts than there are words in the New Testament. That's a lot of differences. Well, those are the differences we have. What about differences that were put into the manuscript before our surviving copies started appearing? Our New Testaments today, our Novum Testamentum Graece, are largely based on manuscripts produced in the 4th century. Sometimes manuscripts in the 3rd century are helpful, sometimes they're extremely helpful, sometimes they're relatively full, but for the most part, our Greek New Testaments agree with manuscripts found in the middle of the 4th century, 2 manuscripts in particular. These 4th century manuscripts differ significantly from the manuscripts of the 9th century. The 4th century manuscripts we rely on differ significantly from the ones from the 9th century. If they differ significantly from the 9th century manuscripts, why should we think that they are very similar to the manuscripts of the 1st century? We simply can't tell because we don't have any 1st century manuscripts to compare them to. But there are several things that we can say. Our earliest surviving manuscripts, the papyrus manuscripts that are very old, older than the 4th century, differ from one another more than the later manuscripts differ from one another, and the early manuscripts differ more from the later manuscripts than the later manuscripts differ from one another. This shows that the early transmission of the text was not carefully controlled. Moreover, the scribes who produced these earliest manuscripts, as a rule, appear to be much worse than the later scribes. As a matter of fact, it is generally conceded by textual scholars throughout the world that the most radical changes to the text of the New Testament were made during the first 150 years of its transmission. During the first 150 years is when most of the changes were made, but those are the centuries for which we have no manuscripts. The later manuscripts that we do have were all based on those earlier ones that were lost that appear to have been quite different from one another. What possible grounds could we have for assuming that the earliest manuscripts, whose copies we don't have, produced highly accurate accounts? What evidence could we have? We don't have evidence. Arguably the most erudite scholar in North America in recent decades is the lately deceased William Peterson, whose book, Collected Essays, came out 2 weeks ago, who argues in essay after essay that it does not make sense for us any longer to talk about the original text. The senior person in the field of New Testament textual criticism in North America is named Eldon Epp. He teaches the text criticism seminar at Harvard University. He also has written essays arguing that it no longer makes sense to talk about the original text. The chair of the New Testament textual criticism section of the National Society of Biblical Literature meeting is Anne-Marie Lyondike, who is a professor of religion at Princeton University. She also does not think that it makes sense to talk about the original text. Her predecessor in that field was Kim Haynes-Eitzen, who is chair of the Department of Religion at Cornell University. She also does not think that we can talk about getting back to the original text. The leading scholar in the field in the English-speaking world is David Parker, who teaches at the University of Birmingham in England. He's written an entire book arguing that you cannot get back to the original text and it doesn't make sense to talk about the original text. These are not extreme views. These are the views of the leading scholars in the English-speaking world.
Conclusion. It is absolutely impossible to reconstruct the lost original manuscripts of New Testament. It's impossible to know who wrote them, where it was written, and what was written in it. A question for every Christian who are honest, knowledgeable, and not close-minded or obstinate. Is New Testament trustworthy? An honest person will never respond to this question yes. The honest answer to this question is no.
Like, share, and subscribe to create awareness. We are also available on Facebook, Google+, Twitter, and Pal Talk.